we are, of course, supposed to be energy independent at this point. Greenpeace warned that the total cost of the oil purchase could exceed $2.6 billion in public funds, a stark contrast when put next to the proposal put forth by the House Democrats just hours earlier, which calls for an estimated $1.7 billion in helping working families and children to weather the public health crisis. So you can see even when we're talking about relief for such a major virus, you can see that the price, you really see a very clear visual of what price is put on which group. And I think that's also came again for when I think it was yesterday, they decided to inject, which by the way feels like a week ago, they decided to inject $1.5 trillion into the stock market for pretty much was just an hour blip on the radar screen, when still so many people are very much worried about this coronavirus. And those two moves to me just like does not make any sense.
Well, can I comment a little bit on the stock market injection, so to speak? So when it comes to what the Federal Reserve did, they did inject $1.5 trillion into the Treasury bond market. But the thing about that is that they pretty much, how it's actually structured, and I think a lot of the political firebrands on the left, Robert Reich, AOC, Rashida, they've been hammering in this point. We just gave away $1.5 trillion to these banks, right? Because the stock market fell a little bit. But what the Federal Reserve actually did was it loaned out $1.5 trillion into the Treasury market, right? And that goes to a lot of different banks. Like governments take involved, the Treasury market, it's an international market, right? Even the American, even like your old grandma, grandpa who buy treasuries and stuff. And it's pretty important because treasuries are supposed to act as collateral for financial transactions between different governments, between different banks. And when it dries up, right, it's like when you go to your ATM and you try to withdraw money and no money comes out. And this 1.5 trillion, eventually it does get paid back, right? It's not this money just isn't disappearing into the pockets of Jamie Dimon, right? And it'll be paid back with a very, very tiny amount of interest too. So I don't think it's completely detrimental as people like AOC would describe it.
Yeah, well, it may have some kind of benefit in terms of like keeping our economy afloat, or at least the top parts of our economy afloat in very unstable times. But I think it really shows that the government could be really, when we hear about like how we can drag our feet about when it comes to actually helping the working people of this country, about, oh, we can't pay for this, we can't pay for, like, just putting that money in, for example, to student loan debt. And we forgave everyone's student loan debt. That would cost literally around the same, or $1.5 trillion. That would be, I think, incredibly helpful to the economy as well, because you'd probably see an explosion of people buying homes, people participating more in the economy, and a lot more stability in the millennial generation, which would be incredibly detrimental to the economy, probably more so than whatever the banks are able to contribute from this $1.5 trillion injection. It just shows you when you put money back into the economy for the or quote unquote trickle up economics, when you utilize that strategy, I think it really turns out to be more beneficial, especially in this scenario. It seems like it's just like a no-brainer that if all of a sudden we can spend $1.5 trillion out of nowhere, we should be able to put it towards something that would help the economy, I think, more.
I can't let you off the hook on this one too easily, Spencer, so I'm going to have to push back on this again.
Okay.
When it comes to that contrast between student loan debt and what the Fed did just yesterday, what the Fed did ultimately, like the U.S. government, the taxpayer, we're not losing money from it, right? But when it comes to student loans, right, I think one of the big question marks for conservatives, just to play devil's advocate here, is where does it end, right? Yeah, we can wipe away this debt, but ultimately, isn't it just a big handout to our universities, right? What's to prevent this issue? And it's the same issue with making college free, right? It would be the biggest handout, right, to these private institutions, some of them which are very, very predatory, right? Like University of Phoenix comes to mind, ITT Tech, and they just exploit the government. And I think like we need to be wary of government intervention in both of these fields, right? Because, you know, if we bail out the banks, if we bail out the colleges, they know, right? We don't need to be responsible with money, right? The government's got our back. What do you think about that?
I actually have first a question. Is like, how do we not just a point of clarification? Like, how do we not lose any taxpayer money with the $1.5 trillion injection? Yep. You're saying that that's all going to be paid back?
It's all a short-term, like any treasury, right? It's pretty much created out of thin air on the credit of the United States government, right? We pretty much, in essence, loan it back, right? They use it as collateral. It expires, and there's a very, very tiny amount of interest. To be honest, the interest, it's less than inflation, and that makes sense, right? Because these are, like, a treasury pretty much just acts as cash for different transactions between the banks. But this 1.5 trillion, I guarantee you, the United States is not losing any money on it. Okay, and I encourage any viewers to look it up. Look up repo markets and such and how these things function. The Fed does this all the time.
Well, I think time will tell on that, but we'll check back up. But
to be fair, there are some pretty big issues with this. Like in a healthy economy, the Fed, well, we haven't had a healthy economy for the past, like, since Obama, right? Since Bush, the Fed has had to like just pump more and more money into the markets. So you could say it's unhealthy, but it's not exactly the same thing as the government paying back all the loans for students, right? Or directly like paying for something.
Yeah, but I really just don't get the way, like, how you're putting it as a bailing out of the colleges. Like, I mean, it is like the money would presumably go to the colleges, but it helps. I think it helps working people way more than it helps colleges. Like the benefit to working people here is much, much more than colleges, and I think it really shows you, like, where I really don't see the logic behind that framing.
Let me put it to you this way: do you think if you're the dean of, let's say, Harvard, all right, do you think it would make sense for you to try to lower tuition prices or to try to at least stabilize them if you know that the government will pick up the tab?
Well, I think there's two different things you could do at once. Like, you could go after what I do agree is to be the predatory behavior of these colleges, but you can also, through a very, I think, economically feasible and very economically sound method of putting the $1.5 trillion back to working people and people who, not even necessarily working people, just people who have that student debt, which is just all people, different types, all shades and stripes, if you will. So if we put that back there, and then I think it certainly makes sense to take that next rational step and say, hey, why did this get so high in the first place? With the predatory behaviors we're talking about, I think you can deal with those two things at once. Although I think there may be a little bit too much government intervention for you there, Edward.
You're funny. I think. Well, let's get to the roots of it. Why do you think this crisis has gotten so bad? And like, you give your take. I have a hot take coming up on this issue.
Oh, okay.
So get ready.
I mean, I would just say that it's like people have just been allowed to just get away with it for too long. Like, they've seen the colleges have been able to, like, see the opportunities, and more people have gone to college, and college has, I think, also become such a necessity. And I think it's a little bit more unfortunate. Like, having this expansive education has become such a necessity to being competitive in, like, the current job market and moving up a rung. Like, that's the way the economic system, I think, has really shaped out. And the colleges, I think, have just taken advantage of that to the detriment of people who, especially, like, lower middle class, working class people who want to maybe take that special rung up the social economic ladder, and really they pay the price for it until they're very old, paying off those debts.
So I'm going to say something. It's a bit unorthodox. It's a hot take, but I would argue that, yeah, it's a responsibility issue. But I think there's more blame that can be put on students than people may like want to at least assume, because the whole comfortable idea is that it's this very predatory one-sided dynamic, right, where it's just some of these certain colleges exploiting these certain students here, here, and here. But I think it's a problem with the students, it's a problem with the government, it's a problem with some of the more elite colleges, which set the example, of course, with tuition prices. But I think too many students at this point are going to college, not too few. And like, I think it shows in the stats. So some of these degrees, basically as a college, right, like if you look at the student population, there's no incentive to keep prices in check, because students have to go to college and students have the government's credit card to back them up for it.
But how is that the students' fault though? Like they have to go to college because they want to be able to find a secure job. Like it's very, very hard to succeed and really make a stable income and a lot of money without a college degree. I know both of my parents have a college degree. We live in like a relatively affluent like neighborhood, but that is, I think, a big part of it in terms of getting success. And I think they really have nothing but their own credit card to back them up.
Oh, yeah, around here at least. But the problem with how our government operates with student loans and such is that students at least have no incentive to pursue degrees where the return on investment warrants anything, right? Because of these loans. These loans distort their incentives. And also another issue with that, right, is that a lot of, like you were saying, your parents, they're college educated. One of my parents is, but there are over 6 million people in this country right now working entry-level minimum wage jobs with college degrees. Now, it can be argued, right, if we think about it through a productive lens, how our economy can be more productive, these students do not need or did not need their degrees to have these jobs. And I think the population is a bit overly educated, right? And it's not clear if this education is worth as much as we're paying out.
I mean, I really think that, like, if you look at it that way, like, I think it just really creates a class of separates the kind of the difference between the two classes, like the poorly educated and the non-poorly educated. Like, it's such, I think, creates a really kind of a really almost dystopian kind of like hierarchy there, if you get what I'm saying. Like the people who just aren't allowed to go to college, and maybe there's some other factor that's keeping them. Maybe that's just the way our job market is now. Like maybe they can't do this for X, Y, or Z. But it is like I don't think any of these situations that you're describing here can really be traced back to the blame that the students have. Like they're just trying to do, I think, really what the economic market dictates that they have to do to find success. Like I don't think they're crossing their arms and saying, oh, I want to work a minimum wage job. I don't want to like go further with my college degree. And I mean, I think that kind of like limiting who can possibly try and achieve success is, I think, it's a very dangerous road to go down on.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm not saying that, it's every man for themselves out there, right? The students shoulder all of this blame. But I think the students, a big part of the course of action that they've decided to take has been influenced by the government distorting the market and distorting education through the widespread availability of these loans. I encourage any of the viewers, right, listening right now to look up when student loans are created. They're created during the space race. They're created either by Eisenhower or JFK. But if you actually plot it out, you can see that every year after the inception of student loans, you see a clear trend of tuition prices, of book prices, of housing prices. They just skyrocket, right? Because when the government offers so much cheap credit to finance these educations, and the population really does believe this myth that honestly these colleges sell, that you need a college education in order to move up, then there's no incentive for them to keep prices down. So they just raise the price year after year. I think this year actually tuition crossed $100,000 per year for the first university. And University of Chicago takes that honor, of course. Oh, wow. But it's a big issue, right? And I think one solution is to starve the beast.
And you mean stopping the colleges from, paying that or charging that much?
we should remove the availability of student loans and make it vary for